Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu, and I hope all of you are having a really nice day today. Today, I'd like to continue with my discussion of the films in the Criterion collection. So that means that today I'd like to share with you some comments, if I may, about the release that is Spine number 13. The Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme and starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. This is a very classic film. Well, it's a contemporary film that is a classic, let me put it that way. This is the Blu-ray from Criterion, which was released rather recently, so it comes in this nice digipack release, and we can see here this opens up like so to reveal the inside, which houses the booklet and two discs, a two-disc Blu-ray set. The features include an audio commentary from 1994 and also a new interview with the great critic Maitland McDonagh and 38 minutes of deleted scenes, which is also very nice. An interview from 2005 with director Demme and star Foster. 4 documentaries featuring hours of interviews with cast and crew, a behind-the-scenes featurette, storyboards, trailer, and plus a booklet with a number of very interesting essays and photographs, like so. This is all very interesting and quite illuminating, and this is another example of Criterion Collection packaging at its finest. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the details and specifics with respect to the film itself. So if you have not yet seen the film, The Silence of the Lambs, I urge you to turn off this video and you can come back at any time and you can watch this video, because I will be giving some details and making some discussion about certain plot points that might be considered spoilerish. So the last thing I want to do is to ruin the fun and to spoil your experience of the film. So please turn off the video and you can come back at any time, and I'll be very happy to continue our discussion of this very interesting film, The Silence of the Lambs. This is a very stylish thriller, and it's a horror thriller in the sense that there are a lot of very gruesome elements to the film. What's amazing about this film, I think, from the outset is that it's not in your face. In other words, the horror elements, the violence towards human beings, the kind of maybe explicit violence and special effects, those are pretty much off screen, and those are left to the minds of the viewers. There are occasional bits where there are some explicit scenes of violence that take place. There's a close-up of a head in a jar, and there's some scenes involving skin and faces, and there's some gunshots. But for the most part, many of the violent scenes, the carnage, is left to the minds of the viewer to imagine. And I think that is an overall effective way to deal with this. And I think I would dare say further that that approach, that quote-unquote restrained approach to the violence, has actually helped to keep this film from aging. I think it's aged very well, and I think it holds up incredibly well even now. So this is quite interesting. I mean, this is almost 30 years old, and yet it still feels very fresh. And I think that has to do with the fact that maybe the way it portrays violence is toned down in a way that doesn't date the film necessarily. There are other ways, of course, that the film is dated, but it's time specific, and I don't think that's detrimental. But I guess my point off the bat is that it's approach towards violence is very restrained, and I think quite classy, given the subject matter that it's dealing with: serial killers and other serial killers, and the FBI trying to catch the serial killers, and we see other places of this kind of violence. So I think for the most part, I think the violence is well restrained and quite tastefully done. But there are also moments of true horror, and I would think specifically there's a scene involving the examination of a body of a young woman who is dead, and the examination involves looking at her quite gruesomely disfigured corpse, and there are places where skin is missing, and we're dealing with some looking at close-ups of mouths and fingers and all that sort of gruesome stuff. But I think that stuff is done very it's not nothing. The camera doesn't shy away from that. So I think there's a certain point to the way that the film portrays violence. I don't think it aims for any kind of exploitation in terms of violence, but when it shows the aftermath of the violence, I think it's meant for us to realize the weight of the violence and the killing, and therefore it has certain quite gruesome effect and emotional effect, and we realize that this is the terrible thing that can happen to a human being that was once alive but now who is dead. Then of course there is the characterization of the characters. In particular, of course, you have the two people at the top. Well, of course, I think the one character that's at the top of the film is of course Clarice Starling, played magnificently by Jodie Foster, and there is much to be said about her performance. It is very nuanced, it is very layered. I love how Clarice Starling seems a little bit, how shall I put it, she's young, so therefore she seems inexperienced, and maybe she is a little bit impatient, and she does make some mistakes, but Jodie Foster and the film are not afraid to show us those mistakes. They aren't afraid to reveal the vulnerabilities of the character of Clarice Starling, and I think that is really helpful overall, because it helps us, the viewer, to sympathize with her position much more, and we really are invested in her character and what she does. In particular because she is a woman in this incredibly male environment. I mean, one of the most famous early shots is when she is called to Jack Crawford's office after she's been having a bit of a training run, and she goes into the elevator, and the elevator's filled with men, and she's the only woman in the center. So that's just a wonderful visual motif that runs all the way through the film. You know, she has to hold her own in this world that is essentially dominated by men. And not only does she have to hold her own in terms of her own professional ambitions as an FBI officer. At this point, she's a trainee and student, but also she has to hold her own in the sense of trying to fight against the notion of being sexually objectified by certain men around her. For instance, Dr. Chilton, and there are other people who try to sort of hit on her during the course of the film, and Hannibal Lecter too seems to project that kind of sexual objectification, at least in the context of their conversations. So this is an interesting aspect of the character of Clarice Starling. You know, she has to try to find her way through this world in more ways than one. And so therefore, we as the viewer can really sympathize with her situation. And we really root for her, even as she is progressing towards the denouement, or the final outcome, with respect to the investigation into hunting and capturing Buffalo Bill. And then, of course, there is the landmark performance here by Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. This is probably the role that he will be remembered for the most in his very illustrious career. Hannibal Lecter is like Dracula. He's like the Frankenstein monster. He's like the mummy. He's like he's like Jason and Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers, even, in the sense that he has become, in one way or another, a kind of iconic horror villain. And he has now, this film is the film that I think introduced many people to the character of Hannibal Lecter. I mean, of course, I know that there have been other actors that have portrayed Hannibal Lecter. In fact, there was a film that was made prior to Silence of the Lambs that had a different actor portraying Hannibal Lecter in a different novel that is connected to the story and events and the characters of Silence of the Lambs. But it's here, of course, that it's Hannibal Lecter and Anthony Hopkins. Those two names, I think, are synonymous. And I think for good reason, because there are many parts of his performance that are flashy, and there are many parts that are quite gruesome. But also there are quite a number of moments when he shows his humanity in a way that is oddly moving. I think for me the highlight of that would have to be the scene where he is in that cell, in that big room in the courthouse towards the end of the film, and he and Clarice are talking. And she finally reveals to him the story about how she, after her father died, she tried to save one of the lambs from the ranch that she was living on at the time, and she couldn't save the lamb, and she was then sent off to an orphanage right after. But this was a very traumatizing and very significant moment of her childhood, right soon after her father had died. And you could tell the close-up in Hannibal Lecter's face as she has finished the story, and then he very softly whispers, "Thank you, Clarice, thank you." And even then, as she urges him to tell her the real name of Buffalo Bill, which is not Lou's friend, but his real name, he just ignores her and just looks up towards the sky and kind of closes his eyes a little bit. And you can tell there are tears welling up in his eyes. It's almost as though he's about to cry because he is so moved, I think. I think in a number of ways we can interpret that moment. Maybe it's a way in which he has become a doctor again. After all, he is he is a doctor, and his job was once to help people with their kind of psychological issues. And so here he is listening in on what could have been a patient of his. So perhaps that is a reminder of the life that he once had before he became a serial killer. But also he, I think, is moved by the memory of Clarice and the trauma that she currently is enduring at this very moment as she's trying to find the daughter of the senator's kidnapped daughter. So I think there's a lot to that moment when we see him look up. And he's about to cry, but then he realizes Dr. Chilton enters, and then he says the line, "Dr. Chilton, I presume. I believe you two know each other." So there's much to be said about Anthony Hopkins' performance, and I think it's been lauded, of course, in many ways, and it still is highly respected. It's one of the great iconic performances in contemporary American cinema history, and for good reason, because it is a true tour de force. I'm a great admirer of the style. I love the way the close-ups are used in this film. The close-up here has so much power and so much significance and importance to me that I think it's almost, well, let me put it this way. The close-ups in this film almost remind me of the power of close-ups that I identify with in the film Citizen Kane. And I'll tell you why. In Citizen Kane, the way that close-ups are used in that film and the way that Wells uses his camera is such that we close in on a face of a character, and it's not just a close-up just to see the character's reaction, but we realize also that the close-up is there to show us that indeed the character is really not what he or she seems. In other words, we sense that via the close-up, a character is thinking something other than what is going on. And that could be a suggestion of deceit, it could be a suggestion of betrayal, it could be a just suggestion of something something other than what it is right then and there in the scene. And in other words, the close-up is paradoxical in that it shows so much and yet it reveals so much other than what is on the screen. And that to me is one of the great beauties of this film. You know, there are so many close-ups on faces here, and I think for the most part that is meant to show us the landscape of the face and is meant to give us an intimate portrait of these characters in a way that we can become involved in the scene. The characters are making eye contact with us and they are talking to us, and maybe that makes us more intimately involved, maybe so much so, maybe too much so in some instances, especially when we are talking with Hannibal Lecter, or perhaps even Buffalo Bill himself, Jame Gumb, or as he calls himself at the time, I think Jack Gordon. And so therefore we are uncomfortably locked in eye contact with these monsters, and I think that's a wonderful effect, and that's one of the great things about the close-up here. But also the close-ups sometimes show us things or suggest things to us that are other than what's on the screen. For example, the famous close-up at the end when Jack Crawford and Clarice Starling shake hands, and there's that wonderful close-up of Jack Crawford grabbing onto her hand. Now, what does this close-up mean? Why choose that particular moment to close in on the hands of all things? Well, I think it could be interpreted many ways. It could be interpreted one way of being just simply Jack Crawford's acceptance of Clarice Starling. You know, at this point she has graduated and she has become a full-fledged FBI agent. So now this is his acceptance of her, perhaps in a professional capacity. It could just be also that he feels congratulation, and it just shows the bond that they have created via this investigation. But also there could be some kind of sexual tension that is being projected, perhaps more so from Jack Crawford than from Clarice Starling, but still there could be a sense that this physical touch of the two hands could be suggestive of some kind of sexual tension or attraction or something else of that nature. And so therefore the close-up here is showing us something other than what is being showed on the screen, and I think that's fascinating, and it shows again the paradoxical power of the close-up in cinema. There is this notion that the fact that the serial killer Jame Gumb is a transsexual, or I should put it more specifically, according to Hannibal Lecter, Jame Gumb thinks he's a transsexual. There has been criticism about the film in the way that the film depicts transsexualism, in the sense that it seems to be linking transsexualism with violence. And I can see that criticism quite clearly. And to me, it's a pretty, maybe it's not such a good aspect of the film. But at the same time, I can understand, or I can see at least, the other side of that coin, namely that Jame Gumb is not meant to represent transsexualism as a whole, or transsexuals as a whole, but he is meant to be seen as an individual that is disturbed, and quite disturbed. And this is helped by the fact that Hannibal Lecter describes him as being not a transsexual, but he thinks he is a transsexual. And the reason that is because he grew up in a very abusive family, and therefore these years of systematic abuse led him to become a man who had a very violent nature, and that he felt that the way to solve his quote-unquote problem was to have sex reassignment surgery. But the fact that he was unable to be accepted at the hospitals that carry out such surgery meant that he could therefore, in his eyes, only transform in a way by donning the skins of women. So, therefore, Hannibal Lecter's description of Jame Gumb and his pathology is suggestive of him as an individual, a very disturbed individual, but not necessarily encompassing all of transsexualism. While I can see both sides of the interpretive argument, I do sympathize with that side of the argument which seems to be critical of the film, based on how it seems to be depicting transsexualism. So I'm very sympathetic to that line of interpretation. Another thing I found very kind of critical of the film are just some of the set pieces. So, for example, for instance, there are two set pieces in the film that are just spectacular from a narrative point of view, and from as a viewer, you feel very exhilarated. So there is a sequence when Hannibal Lecter escapes, and then there's also the sequence where Clarice Starling finds and kills Buffalo Bill. So those two sequences are just electrifying as cinematic suspense sequences. But I always found them to be a little bit ropey in terms of believability. So let me explain. So, for example, for Clarice Starling's capture and killing, or not capture, but killing of Jame Gumb, she goes into the house alone, or down into the cellar alone, and she doesn't wait for backup. And even after she finds Catherine Martin in the well, and she realizes that Jame Gumb has actually proceeded further into the interior of the cellar, she doesn't stop and she doesn't wait for backup, but rather she decides to proceed on her own into the depths without making any assurances other than, she doesn't wait for someone to arrive, and she doesn't realize any other kind of standard operating procedure, I think. She decides to go in by herself. So, I don't know, I always found that on the one hand to be a little bit maybe irresponsible of her as a character, kind of a rookie mistake. But on the other hand, the more I think about it, the more I realize that this is so in line with the character of Clarice Starling, because Clarice Starling, not only is she wanting to save Catherine Martin, in order to stop the screaming of the lambs, so to speak, but also we realize, or at least I realize by this particular action, not only that's her goal is not only that, but her goal also now seems to be clear, which is the killing, or the capture and killing of the serial killer. So that seems to be her ultimate goal. And it's very interesting because she seems to want that more than saving Catherine Martin in a weird way, which is why she seems to want to pursue the villain further and by herself. And so therefore I think it's a rookie mistake, but also it's very showing of her character, and it's very consistent with her character. And therefore I can forgive that mistake, as it were. Another similar thing happens with me when I watch the escape scene by Hannibal Lecter from the courthouse. I was always very I find the scene very exhilarating, and it's frightening, and the reveal with him in the face, I think, is quite shocking. I always found, however, a little bit annoying how there are so many guards and policemen on the first floor, but on the actual floor where the cage is, there are only 2 policemen guarding him, and there's no one outside the room. There are no security cameras, nothing. I always found that to be a little bit too easy. I mean, it was very easy, therefore, for Hannibal Lecter to subdue these 2 guards, not being observed by any CCTV. So, I don't know. I always found that scene to be a little bit gosh, I wish there had been a little bit more effort put into those details. It would have made his escape much more grander, for lack of a better word. But, oh well, I mean, I understand it's a film, and I understand that by this point in the film, which is rather late in the film, I think we are already along for the ride, so to speak. So our suspension of disbelief is at a certain point where I think we can forgive the film for these flaws, although upon closer inspection, at least I realize that it's a little bit ropey. Okay. Still a magnificent scene, a magnificent sequence, and my goodness, this is something that shows us the power and the horror of Hannibal Lecter. With that in mind, let me just end my discussion of this film here. And with that, I hope the lambs have stopped screaming. So, have they for you? Tell me what you think of this film. Do you like this film? Do you not like this film? Do you have any thoughts about this film? If you have any thoughts or questions, please, anytime, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I will be very happy to try to address them to the best of my ability. Okay, so with that, this has been Spine number 13. Next time, I hope to discuss with you Spine number 14, which is the first film in the Samurai trilogy. So until then, my friends, I hope you have a really nice rest of your day, and please take care.